Fantastic. So, thank you everybody for being here, and it's an honour to have been invited to talk to you today. I've been told that you love to participate in lectures and talks and in learning, so I have to warn you immediately that you're going to be participating in my talk today, and I hope that you enjoy that. I've been asked to say something about development and learning. My background, I started off as a teacher, became a psychologist, then a neuroscientist, then an educational researcher, and I brought neuroscience into my research to understand more about what happens in the classroom. So I've had a very varied and broad set of experiences, and I hope to share some of what I've learned with you today. First of all, what do we mean by development? Development involves physical growing, and I think that's a lot of the things that we can see very, very directly, but also that development of social, emotional, and cognitive changes inside the mind. And when I talk about the mind, of course, that mind is supported by this biological set of mechanisms in the brain. And these developmental changes tend to happen in the same sort of sequence for most children and within the same sorts of time periods. And when we see those changes occur, we call that development. For example, at 16 months, a child can find a toy when they've seen it hidden, but at 20 months, a child can start looking for a toy without having seen it hidden. So this sort of change in their thinking we can call a developmental change. But one important point to make is that our environment impacts on our development. So it's not the case that we are born with a programmed set of processes that are going to occur without interaction with what goes on around us. And of course, as teachers, you are an incredibly important part of that environment. So here I'm using the word environment, meaning everything that is not actually the individual themselves. So development arises from our biological genetic basis, yes, the genes with which we're born, but it's the interaction between those genes and the environment that really brings about the changes. So in some respects, you here sitting now can be thought of as a product of your genes, those things that you were born with, that you've inherited from your parents and your family, and what's happened to you up until this point. It's nature and nurture interacting, not just your genes, not just your nature, not just the experiences you have, but the way that those two things come together. And in fact, if you look at it purely scientifically, you could say that your behavior is then an interaction of that phenotype, that interaction between your genes and your environment, and the environment that you find yourself in at this present instant. This is the scientific way of looking at things. So this is a diagram, if you like. Is there a pointer on here? There is. Isn't that fantastic? This is a diagram, if you like, of that idea that development is coming about from your genes interacting with this environment, which all the time is impacting on those developmental processes. So the question is, where does learning fit into this? Well, learning is a part of development. It's supported by development because, to some extent, you need to have, for example, your perceptual processes develop in order to be able to listen and hear and see around you, and that's going to support your ability to learn. But it's also true that learning can stimulate development. So as you learn language, so you become open to a lot of additional experiences that are then going to improve your social interaction and development of your social processes, for example, and your emotional development. So development and learning are actually interrelated with each other. They depend on each other. One influences the other. Learning influences development, development influences learning. Now, development and learning both involve biological change. Because sometimes people think, oh, development is about biology, learning is about something which is not biology. But actually, our learning influences our biology very significantly. For example, these areas, this is not one of my studies, it's a colleague's study, but my colleague looked at which parts of the brain activated and grew in their size as a result of a particular activity. Now, what activity do you think it is? Is it STEM learning? These are adults whose certain regions of the brain increased in size as a result of these activities. Was it STEM learning? Was it social media? Or was it professional development? If you think it was STEM learning, put your hand up. If you think it was social media, put your hand up. If you think it was professional development, put your hand up. Okay, one at the back, two at the back. Okay, well, the answer is it's actually social media. Because these brain regions correspond to social memory. And the size of them can be predicted by the number of friends that you have on your online social networks. This is a reflection of how plastic the brain is. As you learn, so different parts of your brain change their connections, their function, but also their basic structure. They will get larger. So this is amazing because it means that as teachers, you are changing the very structure, the size of the different parts of your students' brains. In fact, you are the only professionals who have that responsibility on a daily basis to change the brains, the structure, function, and connectivity of others. When does development happen? Well, learning involves biological change and development across the lifespan, but because development includes learning and learning involves biological change, then you could say that development can be said to occur across the lifespan, because learning occurs across the lifespan. If you can learn in your senior years, then development is still occurring if we include learning as part of development. But there are particular times when there are biological changes occurring which make you more sensitive to learning. And in this graph here, what we're seeing are changes in the number of connections in the brain, or synapses, with different years. And you can see that in the first 5 years of life, there are very major changes, and they are increasing in terms of the number of connections in the brain, up to about 5 years old. After that, and we're particularly interested in the prefrontal cortex because that's very involved with learning, possibly more than any other region of the brain. And after that, we see that there is a decrease in the number of connections. Now, don't panic, that doesn't mean that learning is disappearing. Actually, the reduction in the connections is a very important part of learning because you're getting rid of the connections you don't need. So this also tends to indicate a sensitive time for learning. And look, actually, in the prefrontal cortex, that decrease in synapses is occurring all the way into adolescence, up to about 20 years old. So that's a very good basis for thinking that all of childhood, even up until late adolescence, is an important, sensitive time for learning. And that's why education focuses on these years, but particularly it should be thinking about focusing on those early years when there are really massive changes, up from 0 to a maximum, in terms of the number of connections that are growing in the brain. Okay, so a very important part of the brain development is the development of executive function. And we can talk about development of executive function in terms of 4 basic types of function. Working memory, our ability to hold information temporarily in our attention. Attentional control, being able to attend to one thing and not another. Inhibitory control, being able to stop ourselves from doing something or even thinking about something. And cognitive flexibility, our ability to shift from one set of rules in one context to another set of rules in another context. Working memory tends to increase in almost a linear fashion as we get older. throughout the years in our childhood. Up until about 14, 16, 18, it starts leveling out then, and we have an adult level in terms of our ability to hold information in our attention. But what about attentional control and inhibitory control? Being able to choose what you pay attention to and what you ignore, and being able to stop an action. Well, these are developmental functions which are actually quite amenable to being able to some educational environments. And when we see this little girl here who's sticking her tongue out at the cameraman, we might say to ourselves, well, is this about her lack of attentional control? Is it about her inhibitory control? Actually, it's quite difficult to say, but all of these things are likely to be contributing. So just to test your attentional control now, if you try to identify which of these following words spell red, green, blue, red, so if you look at those top line there, very quickly your mind will probably take you to this point here. But if I asked you which word is written in red, it takes you a little longer to go here and to go there, because this is quite a strong distractor, because it spells red. And even though you know you should be looking at the colour, your mind is habituated to reading, and that kind of delays you. So this is about moving your attention from one type of task to another type of task, and this is called a Stroop test, and we use this to measure attentional control. It's the difference in time, essentially, between answering this sort of question and answering that sort of question. What about inhibitory control? How do we determine what this is? Well, okay, let's do a little task here. When I do this, you have to do that. When I do this, you have to do that. Let's just try this. Hold your hand ready. Okay? I've forgotten what the other one was now. Was it a single finger? Oh, yes, it was. Okay. Sorry. Okay, very good. Now I'm going to ask you to reverse that. So when I do this, you have to do that. And when I do that, you have to do this. Okay? Hold your hand ready. It's a little bit more difficult, isn't it? And that's because you're having to use your inhibitory control and stop yourself and override that automatic response, because you've learnt the rule. You know, it's very easy to just imitate somebody else, but you have to stop yourself from doing that. We automatically tend to imitate. So that's about inhibitory control. And then there's cognitive flexibility. So here's a little test of a cognitive flexibility. Get ready to sort these sets of 4 words according to different rules. Okay, so think about which set contains a word beginning with a vowel. So it has to begin with a vowel. Which set? So I'll tell you the answer. Those are the ones. They've all got a word in the set somewhere. Ocean, egg, orange, that begins with a vowel. Next task, which set contains a food? So that's the answer to that one. Now I'm going to set you one more little task. Which set contains 2 words beginning with the same letter? And here's the answer. I think. when I did it earlier. Okay, so now if you find it easy to move from one rule to the next, then you've got good cognitive flexibility. But if you find that slightly difficult or annoying, because you've just learned that rule and now you're having to change again, that means you're struggling with your cognitive flexibility. And this is something actually a lot of young children have difficulty with. A classic issue is when you come from the playground where there's a different set of rules in terms of being able to shout out and just do a lot of things that you want to do, and suddenly you're in the classroom again and it's a new set of rules and you have to adjust to that. And that issue is about cognitive flexibility. So this is, I've introduced at least three or four of the different types of executive function. And these executive functions are really important for learning because, for example, when it comes to switching attention, being able to hold our attention, attentional control we're talking about, attention is a platform for learning. So once you get used to following your mum's gaze, your mother's gaze to different objects, which is something that we like to do, it's driven by our reward system. But once you get used to being able to do that, then when your mother looks at a ball, baby also looks at ball, and when mum says ball, then the sound of the word ball starts becoming associated with the object ball, and before you know it, you're beginning to the child is beginning to repeat that and name objects, and this is the foundation of language. So attention is a very important platform for all learning. So executive function is a really, really important thing when it comes to learning. Oops. For example, one of the things that we learn first, and young children learn first, is to recognize each other's emotions. I mean, they begin by actually experiencing their own emotions and then being able to use that recognition, there are tears in my eyes and I'm upset, to realize that other people, when they have tears in their eyes, are also upset. And of course, they're having to interpret it in terms of the context, because it may be that they're crying because something is just so funny. As that develops, so they develop a theory of mind, an ability to understand that others have beliefs, desires, intentions, and perspectives that are different from their own, and they begin to have insight into what those are. And by 2 years, children are able to talk about what they and others want, what they like, what they feel, and we have this emergence of something called empathy, which is incredibly important, and I'll mention that later on as being really important for developing an understanding of the natural world and to care about the environment and the planet on which we live. And that care begins by caring about the others around us, by caring about the people around us. And the basis of that care is empathy, being able to understand the emotions of others. At 3 years old, children can already start talking about what other people think and what they know, and they start recognizing the basic emotions in other people around them as well. So they might say, "Oh, Sam is sad." At 5 years, they're understanding what the cause of somebody else's emotion might be. "Oh, Maria's crying because she's lost her toy." At 7 years, they're beginning to mentalize about emotion. And by mentalizing, I mean connecting emotions to desires and beliefs that that person might have. That there is a difference between the expressed emotion and what somebody might actually be feeling. So a 7-year-old might say, "Well, she says she's not sad to lose, but I think she is." So that sort of subtle, more sort of skeptical approach to interpreting emotions can come through at around 7 years old. By 9 to 11 years old, a child can understand that somebody might view a situation in different ways. There are different perspectives, leading to several different emotions that can conflict inside an individual. She's glad to go on holiday, but she's going to miss her friends. An awareness of that level of complexity. Of course, I should say the ages vary greatly. It's not that you suddenly get to 9 years old and you have that enlightenment. And a lot of that development will come about from being able to socialize and being with your friends, and also the adults and caregivers around you. And emotional regulation is something which is a very important part of this development of emotional understanding. There are lots of different ways in which we can try to regulate our emotions. Our emotions are very important for informing us. We don't want to forget about our emotions, but we don't want to be ruled by them either. And children quickly learn strategies by which they can control their emotional response. First of all, by just avoiding a particular situation. Also by changing the situation into something more humorous, directing their attention away from the situation by just averting their gaze, or reappraising it, reconstructing it in their mind as to what's going on. Well, I don't like the dentist, but I know the dentist is good for me, really. This is a good place to be. And then there's also just trying to reduce the emotional response, which is possibly the most difficult thing to do, and not always helpful either, because it can disrupt your processing of the emotion. Because thinking about your emotions and making sure your thoughts are informed by your emotions is actually very important for your development. So just directly suppressing it is not always good. And a lot of this emotional development comes about through friends. And this, at an early age, about sort of 4 or 5, friendships start developing in a much more meaningful way. Friendships are very good for your well-being. They reduce your stress. They're a stress buffer. They're a source of many pleasures. They're also a source of incredible learning. And that includes emotional learning as well, because the sorts of interactions that you have with adults when you're 3 or 4 years old is very different to the sorts of interactions that you have with other 3 or 4-year-olds. And I would like to just play a short video clip to demonstrate this, but I don't know how that's going to happen. I know there's a video clip here that's available. It's in a folder. Is there a...
Shall we go first in the playground, Fabian? First you get to choose where we go, then I get to choose where we go.
I need to just explain what's going on.
I'll go here. No.
Can you just... Okay, so these 2 4-year-olds have been... they're playing a game in which they're attached to each other using a paper chain. So it's just a piece of paper, really. And they're told that if there's quite a few different pairs of children attached to each other with these paper chains. And the game is, the longer you can stay attached to your friend, the more likely you are to win a prize at the end of it. And otherwise, you can just go and play. But of course, that means you have to collaborate, you have to talk, and you have to negotiate and agree where you're going to play, how quickly you're going to move. So very quickly, some, let's say, discussion arises about that. Now, let's see how these 4-year-olds manage that discussion. Okay, would you just like to play it?
Trust me. No! 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 No!
Kate is the teacher.
He won't listen to me! You're not listening 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 to me! How about you go? You're not listening to me!
I'm going to go and let you play now. So remember, you got to try and not break those paper chains so you can go anywhere you normally would in the playground.
Okay, so that's basically, it's from a TV show that I present where we secretly listen to the conversations of children. It's called The Secret Life of 4-year-olds. But you would never, as a 4-year-old, have that sort of conversation and interaction with an adult. You would only ever face that level of emotionality from another 4-year-old. And so you have to learn to deal with that, and that's a really important learning experience. That unless you can regulate your own emotion, you can't really expect the other person to be regulating that emotion either. So back to the slides. So through play and those sorts of interaction, many different types of development could occur. 2-year-olds are parallel playing with each other, they're watching each other and imitating. 3 years old, they're beginning to share. Sharing is really important. It's something you have to learn. It's not something that you just have innately. And it requires mutual understanding and negotiation, as we saw. Playing in groups means resolving the sorts of social tensions and finding a way to do that, strategy development. And of course, once your language starts developing, you can start putting forward arguments as to why you should do this instead of that. And by 6, there is a sense of group identity. Now, these are based on research in the West, and I suspect that you might get different results if you were looking at children here, for example, in Hong Kong, where I've seen much earlier development, I would say, in terms of self-regulation. Now, I mentioned play. Play is the work of children, and through play, all sorts of skills are developed. Motor skills in terms of movement, executive function, those 4 things we saw earlier, those social and emotional skills, learning from each other. Of course, there are different types of play. Football, constructing a swing, making a den, strategy games are just 4 examples where all of those things can actually help develop these skills here. But executive function becomes more difficult in hot situations. And that's why the sort of interaction that we saw just then, where you're in a hot situation, now psychologists call a hot situation is when the emotional temperature is high and you're under a bit of pressure and stress. That's a place where you can, it's an excellent opportunity to learn at a new level, if you like, because it's more challenging to apply executive function in that situation where the emotional temperature is higher. And emotional regulation in a hot situation like that requires interaction between the frontal cortex here, where you're doing a lot of your reasoning, and emotional centers deep down underneath the brain. Okay, we just talked about it. So, but a good question is, if hot situations can be helpful for learning to regulate emotions, because they sometimes require different types of strategy, which of these do you think might be the hottest situation? Put your hand up if you, I haven't necessarily got an answer for this, there's not a correct answer, but I'm just interested to know which potentially can generate a hot situation where the emotional temperature is much higher. Put your hand up if you think it's number 1, playing football. Okay, interesting. Number 2, making a swing. Okay. Number 3, making a den. And number 4, playing a rule-based game. Okay, so that was fairly evenly distributed, I think, except that there was a general feeling that making a swing might be a cooler situation, which I can sort of understand. I guess one thing about this situation is that it's ill-defined, a bit like making a den. There's no set of rules, and there's not one single outcome which is right or correct, if you like. It's not a matter of winning. So I guess there's more flexibility possible in situations 2 and 3. So play is the work of children, and all of these sorts of skills, those 3, developing executive function, social and emotional development, learning ideas from others, there's strong evidence to suggest that play can support all of those things. But those things can also be developed by formal education, by very structured educational instruction. One thing we haven't talked about is practicing creativity and generating new ideas, which I've been asked to say something about. And play can be particularly helpful for developing creative skills. Which of those do you think would be potentially the most helpful for developing creativity? Number 1, put your hand up if you think it's number 1, playing football. Put your hand up if you think it's number 2, making a swing. Put your hand up if you think it's number 3, making a den. Interesting. Put your hand up if you think it's number 4. Okay, so very clearly we think it's mostly number 2 and number 3. It's that ill-defined problem. There's no one solution which is correct. And therefore there's a whole complex range of different trajectories. And that is, these two situations are much closer to the unstructured play that we were talking about in terms of children being able to develop those other skills as well. So it seems that play is particularly good for developing creativity, because unlike structured formal situations, there is just more scope to be able to move down different routes and explore different avenues. But what is creativity? Put your hand up if you think... no, hang on. Put your hand up if you think that Lego is the most creative task that's going on, that a child can get involved with. Put your hand up if you think it's Lego. Put your hand up if you think it's painting, like that. Okay, what about this one here, drawing? What about this one, playing with something more three-dimensional? Okay, so, I don't know. What is creativity? How should we define creativity? Well, first of all, let's do a little creativity test. If you've got a paper and pencil on you, I'm going to show you a particular diagram, and I'm going to give you a couple of minutes, very approximately, because I haven't got a timer, to write down as many ideas as you can as to what this is. It's actually just a rough, random selection of shapes put together, but we use this in our laboratory to test the creativity of our participants. Okay, are you ready? Have you got a paper and pencil in front of you? Now just write down one word for your idea, okay? Because this is not a writing exercise. On your marks, get set, go. Okay, I'm going to stop you there. Now, there's not a right answer to this, so I can't reveal the correct answer. Put your hand up if you had one idea at least. Put your hand up if you had 2 ideas. Put your hand up if you had 3 ideas at least. Put your hand up if you had 4 ideas at least. Put your hand up if you had 5 ideas at least. 6 ideas at least, 7 ideas at least, 8 ideas at least, 9 ideas at least, 10 ideas. 10 ideas? 10 ideas? Who had 9 ideas? 8 ideas? Who had the 8 ideas? There was somebody who put their hand up for 8 ideas. Okay, so 7 ideas? Yeah, okay, so we've got a couple with 7. So does that mean that the people who had 7 ideas are more creative than the people who had 1 idea? Well, yes. Okay. Not necessarily, because generally speaking, we tend to think of creativity in terms of quality of the idea as well as the actual producing lots of ideas. But there is research to show that the quantity of ideas you produce is related also to the quality of the ideas. So I think we probably should, congratulate the people who got 4, 5, 6 ideas, because that probably does mean that their creative juices are flowing better this morning. Did you find that you slowed down? So you got like 1 idea quickly and then 2, yeah, some people are nodding, yeah. That is what happens. We tend to fixate on the ideas that we've already produced. So once you've recognized it as one thing, it's quite difficult to move away from that because the brain focuses, that wonderful executive function focuses on that idea, and it tends to suppress the brain activity of other possible ideas. I mean, that's a good thing because it helps us focus. But it's a bad thing for creativity because creativity requires a broad focus and being able to make contact with those remote associations. But it's just something that we do, unfortunately. We tend to fixate in time. If I'd interrupted you, which I didn't do, but if I'd interrupted you with just some random nonsense, would it have increased or decreased your flow of ideas? If I'd started doing a dance, or if I'd just told you a joke, even a bad joke, would it have increased? Or put your hand up if you think it would have increased. If you think it would have increased your creativity. Put your hand up if you think it would have been unhelpful and decreased your creativity. Okay, that's very interesting. Actually, the evidence shows, including the research that we've done at our university, that it increases your creativity to be disrupted. It's not like creative thinking and generating new ideas is not like the sorts of thinking processes we associate with formal learning. A lot of formal learning actually is really supported by having a focused environment and not being distracted. But generating ideas is a different matter. And actually, a changing context or some sort of disruption can be quite helpful. So we tend to think a creative outcome should be new, original, unique in some way, so different, But also it's got to be appropriate, it's got to be fit for purpose. So when we've been doing our creativity research, we tend to ask an independent panel to rate things in terms of creativity, and they automatically tend to take into account those two dimensions. But creativity, this generation of new ideas, it has learning at either end because you do need to know about the task, you need to have background information and knowledge. So that focused thinking is really important in the classroom in order to gain knowledge and understanding, even though sometimes the type of environment may not be good for generating ideas. And having generated new ideas, actually evaluating that idea and saying, is it any good? Against particular criteria and being critical about that idea is important as well. It's just that thing in the middle, the generating the new idea, does require a different set of thought processes. Now, I mentioned fixation, and this is a graph, in a sort of idealized graph, but it's based on data, where the number of ideas you produce over time reduces once you've been given a particular task. And we've found that when you disrupt somebody's thinking, when they're trying to generate ideas, the number of ideas they are producing resets itself so that you start producing a maximal number of ideas following the disruption, and then you begin to fixate slowly again. So unlike a lot of other classroom learning, generating ideas actually benefits from being disrupted, and it also benefits from being completely relaxed as well. If you think you're being evaluated, and to be honest with you, I did notice the general number of ideas being produced by this audience was a little bit lower than when I do this with students at home. And I think that's probably because you're amongst colleagues and you're a bit worried, that other people might be looking at your ideas and you feel a bit evaluated maybe. So anxiety and stress can actually reduce creativity. So building new original ideas, yes, you have to connect to prior knowledge, but it's quite often prior knowledge that you don't normally connect to. So you need something sometimes to just jog you out of becoming fixated, because otherwise you'll fixate on the automatic, overlearned, obvious associations of everyday and educational learning. So we've studied this in the brain in an experiment that I did a few years ago. First of all, we weren't sure whether you could study creativity inside a brain scanner, so we got people to be creative in a wooden brain scanner. Because these things are so expensive to use, we didn't want the experiment to fail just because people couldn't be creative inside a very confined space. So we built this, cost about 500 Hong Kong dollars to build this out of MDF. And we put people inside it and we found, oh yes, great, they can be creative in a confined space like a scanner. And then we put them inside the scanner, and we asked them to produce creative stories and uncreative stories using sets of words. And when we looked at the difference between brain activity when they were being creative and being uncreative, we found these sorts of activities arising. You can see there in the frontal lobes in the front hemisphere. But interestingly, because language, and these are stories that they're producing, language is normally associated with left hemisphere regions. But actually, when they were being creative and they were generating creative stories, we had a lot of activity in the right hemisphere. And this region of the brain is about finding remote associations and applying effort to find remote associations, things you would not normally connect to. And we also tried to, in another study, this is actually done by colleagues, this other study, they found that there was a region of the brain back here which is related to automatically thinking about the obvious. So the things that you do automatically tend to be done at the back of the brain. And when these people were trying to be creative, they reduced activation here. So you have to reduce that tendency to be automatic and just go to the obvious association. But importantly, when they were working with other people inside the scanner, so they weren't with other people inside the scanner, but they were communicating with other people outside while they were having their brain scanned, when they shared their ideas, they didn't have to suppress this part of the brain so much, and that requires, effort to do that. So in other words, sharing ideas can actually increase your ability to be creative, because when you share ideas, other people are disrupting your thought processes for you and stopping you from fixating. So for example, how does this work in the classroom? Well, this little boy might be saying, I'm drawing a bird with wings. And in order to get involved with the conversation, this little girl might say, well, I'm drawing a snake with wings. A snake with wings? Who's ever thought of that? It's a completely new idea. So we'd say that was probably quite a creative idea that's come about through that interaction. But you see how it works, because otherwise that little girl might have just stayed with what a snake normally looks like if she hadn't been disrupted by her friend. So another thing you can do is just ask students, encourage students to make unexpected connections. So while they were inside the scanner, we said, make up a story from these 3 words. So I don't know if somebody here can just offer me a story involving just one sentence involving these 3 words. Can somebody give me a sentence? Anybody brave enough to give me a sentence involving the words shine, brush, and teeth? Somebody put their hand up, go on. I've got a willing helper here. My teeth are shining, so I have to, I want my, do you want to come up and go on?
So I said, my teeth is shining, so I have to brush my teeth.
Okay. Teeth are shining, I have to brush my teeth. Very, very good. Well done, thank you. Okay, so now that's very similar to the sort of thing that we had from our participants. And unsurprisingly, when we gave that to our independent panel, and there's no criticism, because it's not a criticism, but this is the sort of story we always come up with when we're given 3 things that are connected. And it's not rated as incredibly creative, but it's what we do. That's the way our minds work. Now, supposing I asked you to come up with a story, or a sentence, let's say, with zip, cow, and star. This is a bit more challenging. Anybody got a story with zip, cow, and star? I've got my very strong student in the front here. My PhD student, my EdD student. Have you got any ideas, Roy? Okay, I zip up the cow to get a star from his tummy. Well done. because that is a more difficult task. Our participants took longer to produce that story. And that's definitely the sort of story that we get. Unusual stories. And they're rated as more creative by our independent panel. In this one, the story was this cow got so fed up with people doubting cows could jump over the moon. Very similar sort of story. Well, not similar, a different story actually, but again rated highly as very creative. But is this just because they've got 3 unusual words in? Or is Royu actually having to think more creatively? Well, the only way we can really know that is to look inside Royu's brain. So that's what we did. We went into a brain scanner and we asked people to do this exercise, and we looked at the brain activity that was generated. And as you can see, there was an increase in activity in the frontal lobes, in that right region of the brain, to do with making unusual associations. It was a region that had already activated when we asked people to be creative. So we can tell from this that actually this strategy, it's not just a trick, it's encouraging the brain to operate more creatively. And of course this strategy is very common amongst surrealist artists, and sometimes it's used in schools, because when you ask children to make something from found objects, recycled objects, that's not just good for the environment, it's also good for their creativity, because they're having to make connections between randomly found things. And I've already mentioned that stress is bad for generating new ideas, so low-risk environments where children are not being evaluated, that's very helpful for generating new ideas. Now, I'm going to start running out of time soon. I did just want to say that play, therefore, is a really important teaching strategy, because it can encourage the sort of environment, these sorts of environments where children are making connections, they're having their thinking disrupted. But play, of course, comes on a continuum from free play, which is completely unstructured, to direct instruction. Just to summarise where we've got to so far, lots of advantages for play in terms of developing skills, social and emotional development, learning and knowledge, but also creativity. And there are 3 types of strategy at least in terms of sharing ideas, found materials and randomness, having low-risk opportunities that we know foster creativity in the classroom. I'm particularly interested in one area of STEM, which is sustainability and climate change education. So I just wanted to illustrate what we've just discussed in terms of that context. I've just helped to write a report for UNESCO on early childhood care and education. And in there, I looked at the link between the developmental changes of a young child and how they go on to learn about sustainability and climate change. What's the link between a child's development and learning about sustainability and climate change? Well, these changes that develop, that influence your attitude to the environment, start very early. What would you say that you see, what do you, I don't know what the AI translator made of that. What would you say you see here? Anybody like to volunteer? What do you see here? I'm not going to ask Royu again. Oh, who said that? A fish. Anybody else? A family. Anybody else? An ecosystem, colours. Okay, interesting. Well, this is not really experimental, and I have no idea about the backgrounds of the people who just replied, but if you were an American, you would probably say a fish. If you're from the East, you would probably say something which is broader, because the attentional style of cultures that come from the East tend to be broader and more holistic than the attentional styles of those in the West, which tend to be more highly focused and individualistic. And when you look at the eye movements of children, you can see that these cultures start diverging very early on And the earliest data we've so far have is at about 24 months. And this is important because actually visual attention predicts cultural mindset, whether you're individualistic or collectivist in your approach, and that predicts whether you accept climate change. You're more likely to accept climate change if you're collectivist. And it also has been used to explain differences in national environmental approaches. So in this report, I identified a sort of logic model of how environmental behaviour comes about. And you can see that it's essentially, after the development of those primary attentional abilities, looking, seeing, hearing, it's a combination of attitudes, perceived behavioural control, how confident you are you can carry out actions, and what people are doing around you, what you think people are doing around you that's acceptable, perceived subjective norms. That all comes together in terms of intentions to act environmentally, but self-regulation can still decide whether you actually do it or not. And when you look at the development that we've talked about, some of the things we've talked about today, then you'll see that, yes, sort of being confident is important in terms of perceived behavioural control. Attitudes, having an attitude that you love nature can be very important, but also seeing around you others doing the same things are likely to bring about an environmental approach as you develop. So we're thinking maybe empathy is one of the most important things, and it develops very early for producing environmental attitudes. Sustainability and climate change, and STEM generally, therefore, is not just about knowledge and understanding. It's about many of these other issues, such as attitudes, confidence, and seeing what other people are doing around you. And one of the ways in which you can build all of those is through engagement with the natural environment. And there's strong evidence to suggest that engaging with the natural environment, working with plants and flowers and animals, and experiencing the natural world can improve your empathy, the social norms in terms of what you expect, self-regulation as well, which is a very basic part of your executive function, but also, of course, language and knowledge about the natural world as well. All of those things impact on you as a young learner, but also, of course, you as a young learner will then impact on the natural environment around you. So it's a two-way interaction yet again. If we just focus down on some of the things that I found when I looked at the research, one of the strongest pieces of information that came through, one of the strongest insights, was that these long-lasting effects of contact with nature. Home participation, about 3 or 4 years old, and a bit later on, home discussion about the environment also becomes very important. But these long-lasting effects of contact with nature seem really important for gaining a respect for nature and also for developing those very basic executive functions which are important for other types of learning as well. So recently we've done a television program looking at 4 and 5-year-olds interacting with each other around the theme of climate change. And in this one task we did, which is, I'm just finishing on, I must only have 5 minutes. Oh yes, I thought I only had 5 minutes left. We asked children to repot some plants. This was the task. And of course, they can learn from this. This is a sort of task which I'm sure is familiar to many of you. Repotting the plant allows a conversation about what the plant's about. These were cucumber plants, so where is your food coming from? Learning about the role of nature in producing the food, learning about how the weather impacts on the growing of the food. That can give rise to a conversation about climate, and I don't think children are ever too young to start understanding about these things. But also, of course, from what I've just said, interaction with the natural world helps develop your organisation, collaboration, your executive function, language abilities, attentional abilities, because when you're repotting a plant, you have to be very careful, very focused. And those attentional abilities are a platform for all the rest of the learning that you're going to have in your life. So this is not just about learning about nature. That's the point that I want to make. Interacting with the natural world actually carries with it many other advantages which are of general importance for your learning in many other STEM areas and beyond. So what happened was that, yes, we asked the children to repot the plants, but we also wanted them to learn about the connectedness of all life. So as well as repotting the plants, they introduced worms for us to have a conversation with the children about the importance of worms for the environment and how worms actually aerate the soil and how they're very vital to the growing of our own food and our own survival. And actually, the worm population is having a hard time at the moment because of climate change and many other factors, over-farming and the misuse of land and the way that we treat our soil. So it was a very good thing for us to introduce the children to worms, and we asked them to put the worm in the flower pot. And the reaction of this little girl called Anaya was complete disgust and shock that she would have to pick up a worm. And at first, she refused to do so. But after having discussed it a lot, and with support and help from her friends, some of which were also very cautious about touching an ugly, slimy worm, she was able to regulate her emotions, collaborate with others, and pick up the worm herself, driven by the social norms that were developing around her. And most importantly, she began to move from the disgust towards the worm and the dislike of the worm towards empathy and an understanding and a care for these worms. In fact, after the task had finished, we kept the cameras rolling, and each of these children have a microphone attached to them so that we can record all their conversations, basically. We then edit that into a program which is broadcast on the television. But even after the task, she then took the bowl of worms with her friend over into a corner of the playground, and they started playing with the worms. This is a low risk. I call it a low risk task because I do love worms. I do care about worms. But if a worm died as a result of handling, it probably wouldn't be the end of the world. But what it is good for is for them to understand how to care for a worm. And pretty soon, these two children, this is unstructured free play, they started asking themselves, well, what does the worm need? What is a baby worm? What's mummy worm doing? What would they like? And then what are they feeling? And talking about these worms no longer as objects of disgust, but as sentient beings with thoughts and feelings. In other words, they began to empathize and care about these worms, and in so doing, begin to care a little bit more about the natural world around them. So, in summary, STEM education is more than just knowledge and understanding. It interacts with development. It's a two-way street. It's good for development, and development is good for STEM. Play, creativity, participation are all important for its foundational capacities, in addition to knowledge building, which is more familiar to us as educators. But also, an important point is that I wanted to really emphasize is that creativity is not about geniuses. It's something which can be fostered through strategies in the classroom. And if you want to know more about the brain and learning, then please, my book is available on Amazon. And it's all about how the brain evolved, but it's written for educators. It was a book that was written for educators. Thank you very much.